Be the town selectman rep.
I texted him the other day and asked him that, and he said he thinks it's Gus.
They elected Gus to do it.
Who was this?
Oh, they elected Gus. Well, I just had the impression. Nobody told me.
Yeah, I went to their organizational meeting.
And the school board is going to be the same guy who drew the same straw. Paul. He drew the short straw. Or long straw.
He's actually the biggest one, yeah, so they have to send him.
Well, I was told by
Why is that?
Scott that he missed the
He's gonna beat
meeting.
him up.
And so therefore, if you miss a meeting, you're dead. So I think we've got most everybody's going to hear this for. Yeah. So why don't we start with the pledge? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now, before we get on to our agenda and what we're doing, Scott mentioned that you would like to come and meet us, and it's a great opportunity.
Yes.
So why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll introduce ourselves.
Well, thank you. Evening. Had a chance to meet a few of you. Ken Hemingway, and I am your superintendent-elect. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to come and meet you and learn a little bit about how this process works and try to work the best I can to establish the best possible relationship as we go through our work together.
Great.
So,
Why don't we start with you, Dave, and go around the room.
David Horvath? I mean, am I supposed to elaborate or just?
no, I think that's enough.
Oh, okay. we can do that, Kevin.
Short biography.
I'm Fred Butler, from the Gunstock Acres Village Water District.
Kevin the editor, we met the other night.
And Kevin's the new
Pat
member.
Labonte.
I'm sorry, Sue?
Pat Labonte.
Sue Green.
Sue Green.
Okay.
Pat Labonte.
Hi, Pat. Thanks.
Skip Murphy.
Yep.
Dick Hickok.
Phyllis Carden.
Kevin Roy?
Dale Dormady.
Thank you.
Well, what we're doing here tonight is every spring we have a meeting to organize and to talk about the past year and the events, and is there something wrong with the way we do things, and so this is that meeting. So the first thing we should do is, because rather than me being the old chair run the meeting, we ought to elect a chair, and then and then we'll go on with, because I've had various people suggest what we should talk about this meeting, so I think we ought to bring all those items up and anything from the floor. But anyway, you had something, Dave.
Well, I was going to nominate you.
Well, like I said before, I've done
Make
it.
a motion.
All right, is it second? Is that the
I'll
best
second
way-
it. Yep, I'll second
Is that the best way of doing it? Anyway.
There's another? There's another?
Well, there's another would be you put a number of names up and vote on, but anyway, I'm open. Like I said before, I'm one way or the other. I'm not hung up. If somebody else wants to do it, I don't have a hang up with that.
Open for comment?
Yeah.
I'm stand behind you as chairman. I think you've done a good job in the past. I think I said this last year at the first meeting. I like the way the meetings are run here. I've been to school board meetings. I think they're a little too on the formal side for me. I've been to select board meetings. I think they're run pretty well. I've heard hours are too wide open at times, but I don't think we need to be following was it Robert's Rules of Order to the letter. I would say maybe at times whoever has the floor should be I don't know, recognized more. I mean, I think everybody jumps in now and then, so maybe if you had a little more control over that, that would be my only thing that I would not complain about, but maybe we can follow that a little more closely.
Any other comments before we vote on this thing? If not, are we vote? What are we gonna do, show hands?
I don't hear any other nominations, though.
Well, that was the only reason I had said maybe there's a different approach, you put a number of names up, but, because this way you have one guy to vote for. But anyway, I'm open. So, all those in favor say, I will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay.
Point of order, is anybody taking minutes for us?
I'm gonna take some
Okay.
minutes because,
Because I didn't see Sandy, so that's why.
yeah, I told Sandy in a note, knowing this was a sort of an off year, that she didn't have to come, and she sent back and said, oh, no, I'm gonna be there. And then she sent me a note and said, I got sick a couple of days ago, I'm just back, and I'm not gonna be there. So I said, well, I'll try and take some notes. So we're all here except the two reps from the various committees, I think. There's 10 of us, right? Let's talk about things to do better and things to improve upon. I thought that Terry made a great suggestion. We're talking about running the meetings. Or made some good suggestions. Not all of them were great from my point of view, but I think my position has always been that we're here and we put in maybe 4 months of fairly concentrated effort. And if you come to this meeting, you don't have an opportunity to participate fairly actively. You say, why do I do this? So I've always been of the opinion too much formality, where, like when I've gone to a couple of the other meetings, there seems to be no discussion. It's blum, blum, blum. So, and it seems to me the discussion is inherently what's good about this, because for one thing, the newspapers normally pick it up, and therefore the voter gets to hear some of the debate that took place. And if there's no debate, none of that gets picked up, and therefore there's nothing passed on to the voters. So to my opinion, that's good. I think Terry made an excellent point that is particularly true of the school. And in the town, we don't, our position has been, let me start that way, that we would recognize some input from the audience early, not once we start deliberating and voting on a subject, but before that we would recognize something from the audience, and then we would do nothing more with the audience. And we had that discussion several years ago, and before seemed to make sense because in case we voted that night, they had their say. In the past when we were discussing and then voting the following week, didn't make any difference. But in the past year, certainly maybe most of 2 years, we've had some fairly cut and dried budgets. We talked about them, we're very happy, and we said, well, we'll vote on it tonight. So the place we've fallen down is we get the school, who has a large representation at every meeting, participates mostly with our invitation through the whole discussion. And I thought Terry raised a good point when he was still on the board, that he didn't think that was right, even though he continued that dialogue as much as anybody, and he recognized that. But I think he's right that we should, whether it's school, town, or public, there should be a finite length of time that any kind of input is heard from anybody other than us. If we have a specific question that needs answered, and there's an expert in the room that we want to call upon, that's our prerogative. But not to take input from somebody just because they're a so-called local expert. Now, that's my interpretation of one of the points that Terry made that I thought was a worthwhile one, that I felt in favor of, so I thought I'd throw that out.
Comment? Oh, go ahead, Sue.
Along that line, I wonder if we should consider the selectmen's format of how they run their meetings. You know, they have Pledge of Allegiance and everything is outlined all the way down the page. I wonder if that's worth considering.
I have no objection to a agenda. I mean, if you look at their agenda, though, that's fairly common sense. Bum, 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 bum. I don't go to many selectmen's meetings. When I have gone, there's been no discussion on any items when they vote on them. Maybe they were all cut and dried.
Well, maybe we could
But I don't like that.
temper it, use
Well,
that
I-
basic format, but temper it our way.
Well, let me bring up I'm sorry, Kevin, you were next.
All right, thanks, Skip. Well, I agree with Sue. I think we've talked about it in the past, having an agenda. And only the fact that some people, and especially if it's out the week before the meeting, a lot of people come to meetings. Sometimes they're teachers, sometimes they're public policemen. I've seen the police department here, I've seen the fire department, depending on what's going on. If they know ahead of time and there's an agenda, then they may show up. Now, my first year, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever it was, nobody came to these meetings. I mean, nobody.
Right.
And over the years, I think we've gotten some decent crowds here. Again, it depends on
Mostly
what's
at
on the
school.
table. Well, sometimes it's school. We had the band thing last year. We had, you know, there's been several other things. And I agree the school does show up a lot. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, there's nothing
But
wrong
I
with that.
agree with what Sue's saying, an agenda maybe might give you a little more control over the input that we do get.
Well, you have a valid input, and I've been one of the guys that probably fought the agenda for years, and I think your point that you just made counters anything I've said, and that is, I've always said, well, we are way ahead of time. We have every week defined as what we're going to talk about. It's on the website. However, scattering of people come in here, 8 or 10. They may not have looked at the website, so picking up an agenda would be very useful. I have no hang-up on that.
I think part of why I would want to see a little more formalization to perhaps much more formalization was based on the last meeting that we had where I did try to cut the budgets. And it seemed like I was in an eternal debate with Scott Isabel, time after time
Right.
after time.
And that
that
actually
was,
an example.
I think that was the most egregious example because it felt like
Right.
I am arguing with the public all the time. That was supposed to be a discussion among the committee members here. And
I
that's,
thought that was a prime example where that was done wrong. Because we look at Scott in particular as sort of a person that we're looking for info on, and in many cases, and this isn't being critical of Scott, he just filled a vacuum we let him fill, as he was giving us argument when he shouldn't have been.
right. I don't mind if we ask a question for information. He is the holder of the stats and the figures and all of that. That's not my point, but I think you hit it right on the head where he was being, you said arguing, I'll just say an advocate. At that point in the process, we were looking to make executive decisions or a
Right.
legislative decision versus the advocacy stuff. And that sometimes has breached or leaked into other areas as well. And I'd like to see that rolled back in.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And in the town, it hasn't been a problem, but just because there is a lot of participation with the school, which is good for us, we just have to control it, and it has to be up front. I agree with that.
Dick, coming at this as the new guy again,
Yeah.
I have to look at it as sort of an outsider. And like Skip said, arguing with Scott Isabel, or, it doesn't have to be a school department thing. I think it's good if you ask them for their input, but that's why we have representatives to the board. We have this gentleman here, and Kevin or Gus, whoever it's gonna be, and the school board rep. They're supposed to be representing their own budgets. They're there to represent their budgets. If they can't answer it, it's good to if you ask them, but they should be offering any opinion.
Yeah. Well, my thinking about that, our agenda should say that, okay, this is the subject, you know, that's going to be talked about. We'll open with the pledge, and we'll talk about which would be done first. And then it would be my opinion that we should have public input before our discussion, because they would know what the topic is, and they can give the input on that topic.
Before our discussion or before we vote?
Well, before we get very far into our discussion, because in my opinion, once you start having a detailed discussion, the next logical thing to do would be to vote, if there's no controversy. If we wanted to and did the old approach, which I don't know how old it is, maybe 5 or 6 years, of delaying it over, you know, talk about it, vote next week, then you could have input later. But in my opinion, we ought to be kind of flexible on the voting.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Because if you had something like Parks and Rec, you know,
Something you
which
need to
was
think
just cut and dried, why carry it over? You might as well just get it out of the way.
But there are times when you need to sleep on things.
That's
And
right.
we need to have that flexibility.
Well, I think that flexibility, and if you recall, last year even, we had voting the following, there was always on the agenda, the one that was set up always had a vote the following week.
The other thing along with the conducting of the meeting that bothered me a little bit is the amount of background noise, talking, discussion,
Yeah.
texting, phones, back and forth within the meetings. And I suppose you can't control a lot of things, but, you know, there is a point of decorum. I notice when I go to either selectmen's meetings, school meetings, a lot of that type of stuff is not tolerated.
Right.
And I think that we need to have a little more respect for this body also in that same regard.
Good input. Yeah, I've been less conscious of somebody talking in the audience, say, than you were, because they were talking right beside you. Maybe it's because I'm hard of hearing, I don't know. But I think that's a good point, but our own, we need to be polite on our own, too, so more control is extra.
Perhaps the vice chair could have some more input during a meeting like that, where you might be involved with something, and the vice chair could step up and say, let's get this under control.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't pick a vice chair.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
need to pick a vice
I
chair.
understand that. That's my point.
Well, I would ask that, you know, we're still gonna maintain flexibility here, right? I mean, are we coming up with any hard and fast rules here? I don't like that, I mean, I understand that in some cases last year, there was more back and more forth, maybe, not back and forth, than there probably should have been, but, you know, on the other hand, this is a pretty small town. We don't have that many people show up here, and I really like to see it when people show up and participate, so I don't want to close the door. I realize we have to control it, but I'm still a little cautious about closing down input that's valid, that's all.
The one I remember, and that's why it made such a impression on me and burned over to this meeting, the one I remember was there's some discussion on, I may have even raised it on, no pay raises for other than the teachers. And Scott made a discussion about some of the low salary people and what an impact it would be on them. And that's the kind of thing that really has no input from a school person. Or, you know, after the input time, that's a perfectly valid input in that input time. But once we're in the detail of the discussion and getting ready to vote, that's not an input from a biased someone else.
Well, let me ask this question along with that. Is that the proper time for, again, the school board or the department heads or the town selectmen, is that the time when you see them using the public input, or are they, because they're part of what we're discussing, consider them separate as opposed to just the average citizen coming in off the street to ask questions or provide some kind of commentary. Because I do see them as completely separate, because somebody like Scott or the new superintendent, it's one thing to hear their input because they're part of the process of going over their budget versus, I'm going to say if Kevin's wife came in and wanted to say something. I'm going blank on names, so I'm just picking on them. I would consider her different than,
Yeah.
oh gosh, I'm so bad at names. Hemingway.
Kent.
Kent. You know, I would see that as being two separate cases there.
They are, except I guess the input I took was that when we asked for, the superintendent to come up with a specific SR, RSA or something that backs some specific input, that's good. But just to have them part of the discussion, I would eliminate that after a short spell.
Well, in line with some of that specific discussion, we sit down in subcommittee with department heads, whether it be, say, like a Sheldon Morgan, John Beelan with the fire department, say Esther Kennedy with special needs and whatnot within the school. So we've had an opportunity as a subcommittee to sit down with people, get a lot of input. There may be times when we come back to full session on that particular segment of the budget where we need input from that specific expert.
And you would request it.
And I see that as us asking them as opposed to
Them volunteering.
A public
Esther
input.
or John Beelan or any of them being a private citizen putting input in. Just as if we would go to the school board and when there's time for public comment, we get the chance to say something. So it would be more us going to the expert for input for a specific thing to give clarification to the whole board rather than the subcommittee. And I think that's valid. But to go to make it that, as we did, and I'm guilty too, because just like Terry and others, we had a lot of back and forth. Perhaps it was valuable to me, but it also takes away from the the effectiveness of the meeting and of the board, I think.
Well, I think it's useful anytime a board member has a question that they can ask of the school or the town. I have no problem with that happening anytime. It's just that if it's not a question and it's some kind, and they raise their hand and give an input, and the one I just gave, that example I just gave, was not due to a question, that was an input offered. That's different than we do with the town. And that's one that was glaring to me afterwards.
So do we need to, I mean, I said I like the way they've been handled in the past, maybe with a little more formality. Do we need, as I think Skip suggested, a lot more formality? Run it the way the school board runs it, and you mentioned yourself, Dick, have public input, and then have our discussions and then vote.
Well, that's always been our process. The place we have, and we've done that a couple of times with the couple of times we've had public input where I've asked for it. The place we have fallen down on that process is the school was generally a free-for-all. If you look back on it, that's pretty much what we let it be. Not with the public, but with several of the school people.
Who are public?
Yeah, they are public, but they are experts. So in my opinion, probably in the future we would prescribe, other than a request from us, their input would come at a given time, just like the public input.
So at any point during the discussion, if one of us feels that either individually or as a group we could benefit from their input,
Yeah.
we turn to them and say, hey, I want to hear what you have to say. As long as we don't close that sort of thing off.
Yeah, no, I think we have to get that because they are experts.
Suggested that.
No.
Just clarifying, and because, I just real hesitant about closing off input of any kind. I personally don't see a whole heck of a lot of problems with the way it was handled last year. Yeah, it gets a little messy at times, but I'm okay with this as long as we're not.
Yeah.
But again, I didn't really see too too big of an issue, although there were times when people were mumbling and stuff and creating some noise.
Well, I think we
It's
have to
distracting.
control that more.
Right.
So three things I've written down so far is the agenda, the control of input from the audience, that we've just been talking about, and more control of extracurricular discussion, if you want to call it that. Yes.
Where would the agenda be posted, if at all? Like, who would the audience for the agenda, who would the recipients be?
We would, well, in my opinion, the agenda is still the schedule set up at the front of the year.
Right.
So if you were online, you would see what the budget committee meeting was about that week, and that's pretty well followed. And then we would have an agenda, my view would be, we'd have an agenda that could be here to be picked up by anybody that comes to the meeting, or any of us.
Will
Yeah,
be
that's
posted.
I'm sorry, the select board does the little stack of them back there and grab one as it comes in.
So just, we wouldn't try to tailor it every week to somebody we thought might be interested in that week's.
No.
No, like, okay.
No,
It's
still
just-
following
just the general
what,
posting.
because right at the, before the town, we set up what discussion occurs on what week, and then before the school, we do the same thing, and we try desperately to follow that. And I think we'd still do that exact same thing. Because for one thing, you know, the school was extra tight. We only have 4 or 5 weeks, 4 normally, and we always have one extra in there, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so we don't have any leeway to say, well, okay, let's digress from the agenda and put this week off. No, that means an extra meeting. That's my view. So those are 3 things. I just saw today in the paper, I don't know if it's a done deal or not, I glanced at the article and didn't read, but that the House passed that there would have to be voter identification for
Yes.
voting, which I've always believed in. That just shows my bias. There's been that hasn't gone through the Senate yet? Or has
No,
it?
not yet.
No, it's not enacted.
Not yet.
I don't think it's been voted for in the House.
No, it got voted on in the
Yeah.
House, but not through the Senate
Yeah,
yet.
because they had to vote in the article.
The
There's
bill
been-
passed Wednesday by the House. The 243 to 111 vote sent the bill back to the Senate to review changes the House made to the Senate's bill.
Because somebody made a point to me to bring up at this meeting that at our deliberative sessions, we should be concerned about who can vote. And, you know, I don't know what the budget committee can do about that, frankly. I mean, that seems to me to be the town and the RSA's responsibilities, but I'm open to input.
Aren't the supervisors of the checklist there when you go through to get their
Yes.
ballot? So that in and of itself is a check, and if that would become law, I would have to make the assumption that
That's
they
what I
would
was
say
saying.
everybody that's standing in line to vote on that particular night would have to show the ID.
Yeah.
That's
If-
what my thought, that's one reason why I brought it up, because that seems to take care of it if that gets passed through both the House and
Yeah,
Senate.
I don't see where that's a budget committee
Right.
issue.
Well, the only time that comes up, though, is if somebody makes a motion and has the signatures to make it a private ballot vote. Otherwise, if it's just a voice vote, you don't know.
You have no idea.
Meaning that those signatures would have to be verified?
No,
No.
no.
When you ask for
When
a
you have a
vote,
voice vote, they tell you that if you're not a member of the town, or, you know, a resident of the town, you can't
Oh.
vote, and we trust you and won't vote, but nobody knows.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
But usually those are the people that sit way up in the back.
they
Not
don't,
They don't
have
they
to.
don't-
No,
They
that's true
usually
too.
ask to sit up back.
That's
In the
right.
last couple of years, nobody's asked.
Again, I kind of
those
look
people
at
to
this,
sit
as
up
I can
back.
understand the concern, but I don't think it's a budget committee point. So I'm open for, I brought it up for,
Is that just something that should go back then to Sandy McGonigal as moderator? Would that be her function?
Yes.
To
That
control
or the
that?
supervisors of the checklist, most likely.
I mean, we could ask that segregated seating be put into place.
Yeah.
Here's your photo ID, you may go down. You are not from this town, by your photo ID, you must sit in the back.
Doesn't the moderator usually ask for people to stand up and identify themselves?
They usually do,
Yeah.
but the last couple of times, couple of years, nobody said a word, no.
Yeah, they
And
tell you
I
to
can
turn around and
remember
look at
years
this person so they
ago,
don't look.
The supervisors were right there at the door. Marge Melky was always there, checking people
And they ask the
into
reporters to stand up.
into the auditorium, and nobody's been there for a long time. So all those people can come and sit and vote on a hand vote, and you'd have no way of knowing if they were residents of the town or not.
Again, I think it's, I can understand being a concern of ours, but I don't know what the budget committee does about it. I mean,
We just ask the town or whoever is there to take care of the voting, that the law is followed. That's all we can do.
Right.
Probably.
I've got a home in Stoddard that was actually my primary home before, primary residence before moving here. And town meeting there, now that's a very small town. When you walk in, the town clerk would be there, and she'd pretty much know everybody that's in town. If she didn't recognize you as being a resident, she asked, you know, who are you? You know, do you have an ID to prove that you live in town? And if not, you had to sit in this section, and you were not allowed to publicly comment unless